All right, everyone. What a fantastic turnout today. Thank you. Let's get started. Welcome. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the Archives and Special Collections Department, welcome to First Fridays. I am Linnea Anderson, a member of the committee and the archivist of the Social Welfare History Archives. Welcome back to our regular guests. And I think I see some new faces out there this time. So welcome to any of you who are with us for the first time. Can we get a quick, if this is your first Friday? I see some, yeah, that's what I thought. Wonderful, welcome. We hope you come back. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former Library Director Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Library's archives and special collections. This year's theme is Roaring Good Tales, Animals in the Archives. We have presentations today from the Charles Babbage Institute and the Northwest Architectural Archives. And lunch today, which I hope you're all enjoying, is from Wally's Falafel. After the program, we will have a tour of the storage facility with Tim. Tim's in the back there. Thank you, Tim. If you don't have a seat, there are additional seats available in room 308, and we're streaming the event up there. So you can just go to the elevator on the opposite side of the building, up to the third floor, and follow the signs for room 308. Before we move on to the rest of the program, we have a short announcement from Kirsten Clark about Friends of the Libraries.
Welcome, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Kirsten Clark. I work here in the libraries, but I'm also on the Friends of the Library board. I just want to take a second to also thank you all for coming to these events. It's really great to see everybody. Many of the presentations are based on collections that actually have their own friends groups, and so I just wanted to mention some of those groups. We have the Associates of the James Ford Bell Library, the Treader Collection, Curlin Friends, Friends of the Anderson Horticultural Library, Friends of the Sherlock Holmes Collection, and then we have a larger Friends of the Libraries group that support many of the things that the libraries do across in terms of events and the collections that we both collect and preserve. So if you're interested in any information about any of those groups, there's some at the back table, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Kirsten. Our first presentation today is Animals, Vegetables, or Minerals, High-Tech Organisms, presented by Amanda Wick, Interim Archivist of the Charles Babbage Institute Archives. At first glance, computers and high-tech gadgets seem the antithesis of organic members of an ecosystem. However, computers and advanced technologies are changing the way we approach the very theoretical foundation of life itself. This talk will look at the ways computers and technology are shifting the very definition of animals, humans, and tech-based organisms.
Thank you, Linnea. So this is a lot of fun. It's a bigger group than I anticipated, but that's okay. So who's excited about animals? Yeah, awesome. Well, first, let me provide a few qualifiers. The Charles Babbage Institute Archives documents collections related to the social and technical history of computers and high technology. So this talk was a little bit of a stretch for me, I'm not gonna lie. So I'd like to start off by saying that I'm going to be pushing the boundaries of the topic just a bit, and I'm asking that you please bear with me as I make these big connecting leaps, and also that you may feel free to laugh at any point, and I hope you do. So this is me when I found out the topic of this year's theme. I was politely irritated with my colleagues. But then I started out with some preliminary internet research, and I was pleasantly surprised. Imagine, if you will, a Google search for animals and computers. Oh, like this might be easier than I thought. I'm like, this is gonna be good. But then as I shared some of my exciting findings, my esteemed colleagues reminded me of how this talk is supposed to go, which is I'm supposed to feature animals from my or CBI's archives. But I could not waste these amazing things I found in my first searches because they are very important and adorable. But then my esteemed colleagues again reminded me that I should stick to the ground rules of the venerable First Friday lecture series, and showing animal memes does not a First Friday lecture make, I was told. I nodded politely. So what are things I could talk about? If I really wanted to do something serious about the history of animals and computers, well, a good place to start would be this. The origin of the term bug when applied to electrical, mechanical, or digital computers. So first we see a letter from Thomas Edison dated 1878 talking about an actual bug that kept flying into the electrical system he was assembling for his prototype telephone. And second, we see an advertisement for a turn of the 20th century game called Baffleball with no bugs in the game prominently noted. And finally, the first collected bug from a digital computer. It's a literal bug. It's a moth. This is in the Smithsonian archives, by the way, not in mine. But all of this makes me wonder, like what makes machines an attractive habitat or an ecosystem for these insects? Does that mean that they're going to survive the apocalypse? Was kind of what I was saying. Yes, that does. And then I thought, it seems like a lot of really bad things about computers are named after animals. We talk about bugs, we talk about worms, we talk about viruses, and we talk about Trojan horses. But then we use friendly human names for computer things, like good computer things. Like we name a whole computer after your daughter if you're Steve Jobs who invented the Lisa. And, these are topics that could work. They're serious, the origin of language is fascinating, and I would have dug deeper, but this stuff doesn't exist in the CBI archives. So I couldn't. It's not, anything we do have is not aesthetically pretty, so it doesn't, I want to entertain you people. So that's my problem. But now I'm starting to panic, because titles and blurbs of these talks for communications are about to go out, and everyone is harassing me, like, what are you actually going to talk about? And so there I was about 6 months ago, digging deep into our archives, panicking, only to discover that there are maybe 2 or 3 topics that I could talk about, and I could really build a solid one around. So here's what I found first. Agricultural computing. Yeah, it's a nice twofold story here. Bill Norris, who's the CEO and founder of the Control Data Corporation, a local supercomputer company, pictured here holding a corn of corn? Yeah, corn, cob corn, cob. You know what I'm talking about. But he's a farm boy, so he's a huge believer in increasing the profitability of the family farm by harnessing the power of computers. And the company invested a lot of money into computer products that would do so, like Swine Track, which is a way to keep track of, obviously, pigs. It was developed in conjunction with the U of M's agricultural program. And it really is pretty ahead of its time, but it has to work on like a big computer, which doesn't make it very portable out into the field. But anyway, we do have the records of that project, and I was really excited about it, because I was picturing cute pictures of pigs that I could show, and I thought that'd be fun. But it is actually a collection that is about how to build a successful software program, which is interesting, but there are no adorable pigs in there, and a lot of software testing QA results, which don't want anyone falling asleep in their wallies. So here's my second option, Squee. This is the robotic squirrel. Squee was actually one of the first commercial robots, and definitely the first to be built along the lines of an animal, perhaps not in looks, but certainly in function. It can move, pick up, and crack a nut. The schematics for Squee were designed by a guy named Edmund Berkeley, who also packaged those machine pieces for sale in one of his educational robotics kits. It's kind of a neat Minnesota story as well, because someone from the U assembled all of these pieces, and it was on display at a Minnesota State Fair back in the 50s. We have Berkeley's papers, but only a very little on Squee, this picture, and some of the schematics for the device. The Computer History Museum out in Mountain View, California, has most of the material on Squee, which is a big bummer because I know them and they wouldn't let me use it. But Squee gave me an idea. It's a computer, kind of. It's an animalian, sort of. And we were doing this stuff back in the 1950s and earlier, if you count the automaton craze. Yep. So what's the history here? When, how, and why did we start building robotics that were so similar to living beings? So now that I've talked about what I'm not going to talk about, You have the right to ask, what are we actually going to talk about? And that's a really good question. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go out on a philosophical limb and start talking about the meaning of life and who or what has a claim to be alive. First, what is life? As we can see here, it's a condition that manifests through a functioning series of systems and processes that can change over time in response to different stimuli. And being alive is all about having or experiencing life. The systems and processes that denote life are actually active. They're constantly firing and in motion. But notice that neither life nor being alive actually require a body. Although it can be inferred that these systems and processes are bound together in some way, probably creating a visual form or shape, like a body. But regardless, nothing in the descriptions themselves indicates the necessity of a body form or shape as a quality for life or being alive. So, life and being alive are conditions without a form, but when we start naming things that are living beings, that's when they gain the form that we're talking about. So, first, an organism. When we think about living beings, the base level is probably this, an organism. And as we narrow down from the very broad condition of life to those that experience it, we land here on animal. And then humans, a type of animal. Looking at these first three definitions, we see some important overlaps in the types of systems and processes inherent to living organisms. You see information processing, you see sentience, you see intelligence, you see metabolic rates. But basically, it boils down to the fact that life as we know it, and those beings that experience it, are really nothing but a bunch of closed systems and feedback loops and processes that are both conscious and unconscious that are somehow encased in something like a container that we see. But then we come to something like this. Because computers, well, they do meet some of the same literal characteristics of life, being alive, and even those of beings. They have a form. But I'm still shaking my head a bit here because I just went out on a big limb. And you're probably shaking your head a little bit or thinking, because everybody knows that computers are not alive, right? Well, let's dig in a bit here. Because I am pretty sure that they can do a lot of the things that living beings can do, like process information, respond to stimuli, adapt to change. I know, right? This is my favorite part. Yes. And apologies to Control Data Corporation founder and CEO Bill Norris for his representation as serious and surprised man in this rendering of knowledge transfer. But in any event, this is where we're going to start branching off of traditional understandings of living beings and start applying it to possibly living things like thinking machines, electronic and digital brains, automation, robots, cyborgs, where the lines blur and machines that are technically alive exist. And to go really deep into this conversation, we have to talk about things like artificial intelligence and cybernetics. So everyone has heard of AI, but fewer have heard about cybernetics. But for those who have, it's often assumed that they're the same thing. However, they differ in many dimensions, as you can see. For example, artificial intelligence grows from a desire to make computers smart, whether smart like humans or just smart in some way. An AI thinking machine is one that is focused on execution of a task or a set of tasks, like a GPS navigator or a virtual assistant. Only it wouldn't be probably smart to call it a thinking machine. It's more of a smart machine because it's set up to do this one thing or sets of things. Cybernetics, though, grows from a desire to understand and build systems that can achieve goals, whether those are complex human ones or just goals like maintaining the temperature of a room under changing conditions. A cybernetic thinking machine, then, is one that is systems-driven and regulatory-focused, like that thermostat that's managing the temperature in the room. A pacemaker is another one. These devices are much more flexible and responsive because designers are considering systems-level data and information inputs, whereas the AI device is focused on isolated bits of information and data. But perhaps most importantly, AI tends to be more purposeful, computer and machine-centric, while cybernetics is much more flexible, it's wide-ranging and multidisciplinary. So if you're wondering why you haven't heard about this, it's because we currently think about it less in its original term and more in terms of something called systems theory, which can be applied to a lot of different fields, like ecology, which is where we get ecosystem, medicine, like neural networks, and our understanding of how the brain functions, economics, political science, and governance. But artificial intelligence. We all have some cultural references that inform our understanding of this. It's a hot button topic. It makes us think of science fiction, makes us think of robots, and the ever popular example of self-driving cars. But basically, it's ways that machines generally replace or can be substituted for humans. And the CBI archive does have some really great stuff on AI, but you'll find most of it in oral history interview transcripts of guys like these, who are Saul Ambry, Raj Reddy, Terry Winograd, and Marvin Minsky. It's a collecting area that we are actively exploring, but one that is currently the specialty of university archives for the most part at schools like Stanford, Caltech, and MIT, which is where these guys all operated. So they get first dibs. Maybe they'll call me if they have some leftover stuff. Maybe. Please. Which brings us to cybernetics and the intersections of organic life, systems, and machines, which is what I'm going to be focusing on for the remainder of my time, for a couple of reasons. One, we have a lot of material on this, stuff that's visually appealing, which is practical. And then this is also a very good time for me to plug an exhibit that is coming up, curated by myself and Professor Matt Hadley, who's a comparative lit professor here. And we're talking about cybernetics in this. And that exhibit will run July 13th to the end of November. So you can see it during next fall's series. And I'll give a little bit more information about that shortly. But a quick refresh. The essential goal of the broad field of cybernetics is to understand and define the functions and processes of systems that have goals and that participate in circular causal chains that move from action to sensing to comparison with the desired goal and action, or desired goal, and then again to action. So its focus is how anything, mechanical or biological, processes information, reacts to information, and changes or can be changed to better accomplish those first two tasks. So what does this have to do with computers and thinking machines? And moreover, when are animals coming back into this picture? This is a good question. Well, computer science is a science with its very foundation in cybernetics. At its most basic level, it's about building machines or technologies that perform functional tasks according to information systems and processes. And as for animals, right now we're investigating the meaning of life and extending our understanding of what exactly constitutes an animal sense. As I think we've already pointed out, it's not as black and white, perhaps, as we may have originally thought. So the idea of cybernetic thinking machines breaks down into two basic categories: full-on machines that incorporate organic systems and processes into a digital or mechanical form, like humanoid or animal robots, or cyborgs, which are human and animal machine hybrids, or technologically enhanced humans and animals. So earlier I talked about how we think about living beings in a visual way, meaning we think about physical bodies before the underlying conscious and unconscious systems. Creating new ones and manipulating existing ones through integration with technology is all that cybernetics is about. And so how does this translate into our traditional understanding of animals and humans as defined by those physical bodies? Well, it pushes us to consider the need for them. Do we need them anymore? It's valid. So, cyborgs, which brings me to cyborgs. The term cyborg is not the same thing as like bionic or a biorobot or an android. It applies to an organism that has restored function or enhanced abilities due to the integration of some artificial component or technology that relies on feedback between the tech and the organism, so it's not operating independently. In science fiction, the most recognizable portrayal of cyborgs tends to be a human being with mechanical parts that are hidden beneath the skin, such as Agent Smith from The Matrix or the Terminator, but cyborgs may also be portrayed as looking more like robots or ordinary humans with exaggerated mechanical devices, like Ripley's mech suit from the Alien movies. Terminator is probably the most famous cyborg we think of. But has anyone heard of biohackers? This is a real thing now. This is a group of people that have implanted or integrated some level of technology into their existing physical body, from LED lights that are inserted under the skin that immediately respond to the person being in complete darkness, to performance-enhancing prosthetic limbs that attach directly into the nerves of the body. Some specific examples, though, are this guy who's an artist named Neil Harbison. He's colorblind. And this cyborg antenna, which is implanted in his brain, basically allows him to see color. This is Stephen Mann. He's a Canadian scientist who basically invented wearables. So like Google Glass or some of the other stuff for virtual reality or augmented reality. That's a camera that's sitting on in front of his face. And it's attached to implants and like those things that, I don't know, anyway. But basically, a simple thought is going to trigger that camera to take a picture, which aids in his memory making. He was pretty forgetful, and so that's why he started doing this. He hacked his own body. And then there's this guy. His name is Rob Spence. He considers himself the first eyeborg because he lost his eye when in childhood accident, like falling out of a tree, as kids do. And what he did is he designed, with the help of Stephen Mann, a camera that can be embedded directly into his empty eye socket that connects directly to his optic nerve. So he now has vision as part of his sensory experience. And biohacking in cyborg technologies is not limited to human animals. It's certainly the most out there, or what we think of as out more there. But there's also this little guy. Yeah. He's a DARPA project, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where they transplanted radio transmitters directly into the rat brains, which allowed those on the receiving end of the signals to basically hack what the rat was experiencing and seeing. It was a development that was expected to be used mostly in recovery of victims, like during natural disasters or during basically like bombing situations. But then we also have the US-based company Backyard Brains, who created the first commercially available cyborg. You can buy these things. They made a roach and they made a grasshopper. And these are bananas because those transmitters are connected to a smartphone app. So you can, via Bluetooth, so you could, if you bought this and you bought the app, you could make your very own roach or grasshopper crawl around. Yeah. The National Institute of Mental Health helped fund this project because it was a good exercise in teaching people about neurology and the connections between physical bodies and neural networks. So, but as you might imagine, animal welfare organizations like PETA and the RSPCA had a lot of thoughts about the ethics and welfare of animals in these types of projects, completely understandable. But this whole movement of high-tech enhancements is kind of falls under the umbrella of something called transhumanism. And just like cybernetics, which represents this multidisciplinary foundation for consideration of things like ethics, rights, governments, and economies of like post-humans and animals. So people and animals beyond just their physical form. It's a wild place to explore. And if you have a chance to go down like a Wikipedia or Google rabbit hole, YouTube, yeah, it gets really interesting really fast. But how do we feel about this? Because eventually you're going to get over the new, this is cool. But how do these intersections between organisms and technology make us feel? Does it extend our definition of life, of being alive, and what is organic? For many of us, this might be an intensely uncomfortable consideration. Which brings us to the uncanny valley theory. This concept was identified by the robotics professor Masahiro Mori in 1970. Mori's original hypothesis states that as the appearance of a robot is made more human, some observers' emotional response to the robot becomes increasingly positive and empathetic until it reaches a certain point, and then it becomes strong revulsion. And then that area between like the semi-human and then the fully realized human is called the uncanny valley, where you feel different degrees of discomfort and revulsion about these pieces of technology. Although there are many scholars actually who would suggest that it's actually an uncanny cliff, meaning you cannot come back. There is no way. Like once you've created something weird that makes people uncomfortable or grossed out, you're not coming back from that. But basically, it just captures this idea that an almost human-looking robot seems overly strange. It produces a feeling of discomfort, and it fails, but most importantly, it fails to evoke the empathetic response required for productive human-robot interaction. So there's many examples of this in addition to the ones noted on the graph. In fact, you may have felt some degree of discomfort as I was flipping through those pictures of cyborgs earlier. But in addition to robots and cyborgs, there are other forms of biotech hybrids that fall somewhere on the scale as well. And so just for fun, we're going to take a look at two of them that don't really count as cybernetic organisms, but there's certainly a form of digital life that makes you reconsider things. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about Cgi Deep Fakes. I don't know if everybody knows about this one, but basically this is the reference file. And based on that physical reality that was represented in that moving or still image, we can now render extensions that are exactly or very closely mimic the original. So that is an engineered version. Can you tell the difference? Yeah. And you can make those things say anything, right? Oh. Yeah, feel discomfort. Welcome it. But just knowing about this, right, like it makes me reconsider and question everything that I see on a screen. It makes me consider anything that I see a talking head. I did read a story at one point about like a newscaster in Hong Kong, I think it was Hong Kong, where apparently for like the last 5 to 10 years, this news station had been using a deep fake to deliver the news. No one knew. And it was like legit news, but they just didn't have a person doing it. Other ones that are kind of interesting is the little happier but still really uncomfortable is the movie Cats. I think for me this is the perfect example of the uncanny valley. I am really uncomfortable with these renderings. They're not real. They only exist as digital files somewhere. But their creation, like deep fakes, is very real, and it's rooted in an intense study of human and animal behavior to manufacture these digital hybrids. Okay, so now we've talked a lot about the ways that our framework for understanding and imagining life is being pushed in unexpected ways, and the fact that this makes people generally very uncomfortable. The idea that our person or animalhood is mutable is frightening. And the implications of people and animals transcending their organic forms through the integration with computers and high tech brings out a lot of big feelings, and many of which are negative, which we talked about the uncanny valley, or they're rooted in fear. So here we see a number of protests that have been happening. A lot of these are labor protests about automation coming into different sorts of manufacturing. But some are also just more general, like no more robots, like AI research needs to be more carefully constrained. And we worry that these types of machines, systems, and enhancements, like what will they mean to normal or unmodified humans and animals? And it's an enormous space where ethicists, transhumanists, computer scientists, biologists, political scientists, policymakers, everyone is starting to engage and struggle with these new questions about what it means to be alive and what it means to be an animal or human. Questions about our visual biases that relate to that uncanny valley theory when we see some of these human and animal cyborgs, and questions about privilege and bias. Who has or should have the ability to transform or enhance themselves or other creatures? Are those enhanced beings alive? Do they have equal opportunities and rights to the unenhanced? And what about fully mechanical beings? Now this seems like the stuff of science fiction novels because it is, but it's real now. And it's stuff that we have to consider. And these, though, are perhaps the platform for a future talk or even debate. And I'm almost out of time. So I'm just going to leave them with you to marinate on and wander off. But before I do, I want to give just a few more details about the exhibit that's going to be going up. We focus on, this is not the final poster, but it is the final dates. So we're focusing on cybernetics as a scientific proxy war for the US and Soviet Union during the Cold War. We're looking at what happened and how that proxy war continues to play out today in both science, policy, and culture. So we're going to be displaying some of the material you saw from this presentation, as well as other items from my collections that rarely come out of boxes, a lot of really rare first edition science fiction pulp novels, some shadowy government reports and memoranda, and some really cool counterculture movement records that are centered on cybernetics and computing as a tool for creating the ultimate utopia. So it should be fun, and it will be up for at least those first First Friday lectures next fall. And finally, one last one. So that's my talk. Thank you.
All right, I feel like we need to bring back the emoji. All right, and our second presentation is Where Animals and Humans Meet by Cheryll Fong, Interim Curator of the Northwest Architectural Archives. And Cheryll will look at the architects and spaces they designed for us to encounter domesticated and wild animals as found in the Northwest Architectural Archives. Thanks, Cheryll.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here since I missed last year's First Friday. So I take great joy in standing here before you and sharing with you some of the delightful things that I found in the Northwest Architectural Archives. Sorry to say there was a rich trove of animals and it was hard to narrow it down. So I hope you enjoy these pleasant pictures. And let me start by saying I am U of M alumni, and so I'm particularly proud when I can promote the work that our alumni do to solve the grand challenges through innovative design. The Northwest Architectural Archives holds the papers created by designers of all kinds: architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, and engineering. It's in the Laurentian Vision Project papers that I first met animals in the Northwest Architectural Archives. Restoring habitat for specific native species drove this particular phase of the project. While this project worked with a timescale of 100 years, it designed reconciliation to be planned for while mining. U of M expertise, in collaboration with several mining communities, developed a template for renewal and community engagement. The sharp-tailed grouse. Beautiful renderings by John Kepke, Professor of Landscape Architecture and Director of Graduate Studies, conveyed the possibilities that thoughtful stewardship of mined land could provide in the North Shore Mining Company, the Peter Mitchell Pit Landscape Framework Plan, and that was written with Christine Carlson. Habitats for fish and wildlife in these now barren landscapes require more from us than just wishes for their return. In this case, what does the sharp-tailed grouse require? What nutrients need to be restored in the soil for their preferred habitat to blossom? These questions drove the framework plan, developed and submitted to the North Shore Mining Company. These renderings take us over the course of many years. Here is a mine pit that has slowly been filling with water and has become a navigable lake. The mined out land becomes a more natural vista through modifications of taconite waste mounds. Haul roads become natural thoroughfares for people and animals. Steep drop-offs amended for graded slopes into the water-filled, depleted mines. And now into the future, canoeing, hikers view a small cascade flowing into the Peter Mitchell Lake from the former mine's westernmost water body. A rocky channel flows down old replanted stockpiles into rich, shallow water habitat. The upland landscape supports deer, grouse, and other woodland species. And that's a quote from their manual. Back to 2025. Warm water fish such as bass, walleye, and crappie thrive in the Living Labs North Shore, created from woody debris, boulders, and muskeg placed in the pit lake years earlier to create nutrient-rich habitat at elevation 1480 approximately. The drawing also illustrates boulders laid to attract fish habitat along the south side of the wall. And this gives you a big picture, such a lovely rendering. And this is the script. What I'm reading is in the far corner, in the small type. The east end of the mine is an exciting demonstration site for soil, planting, and habitat building practices to be replicated throughout the mine over time. Mine engineers will install, test, and monitor innovative reclamation techniques in partnership with the Minnesota DNR. A visitor route allows mine engineers to present and discuss each site with a public group as desired. The Living Lab reflects the North Shore's commitment to implementing the landscape framework strategy. It will also help the public understand the scale and complexity of transforming pits and piles into lakes and landscapes. And this is entitled Framework Strategy Intent. It's the aerial view. And the small print states, to provide North Shore with a flexible, realistic approach to reclamation that will be carried out over time by several generations, meets the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Aquatic Enhancement Guidelines, and incorporates landscape building into production planning. And it leverages nature's capacity to regenerate by helping build soil, habitat, and vegetation communities. The challenge to that phrase, carried out over time by several generations, requires a kind of commitment that will be difficult, especially when mines are sold and new owners take over. Nonetheless, those aspirations of the mining communities and mining companies reside here in the archives. So where else do we find animals? In the Trade Catalog collection. These three are part of a series of publications by Weyerhaeuser, meant for local lumber yards. I love the mid-century vibe of the roadside market stand. Inside are simple plans for building a cattle chute, gates, feeders of all types, and convenient ideas for loading grain. Pardon me. Where else could there be animals? Maybe this looks familiar to you. So let me introduce you to Dewey Thorbeck in the rest of my talk. You might not know his name, but his work has resonated throughout the Twin Cities, greater Minnesota, the country, and internationally. And just a few items from our neighborhood: the St. Paul Farmers Market, the Dairy Cattle Teaching and Research Center on the St. Paul campus, the Hometown Bioenergy Facility in LeSueur, Minnesota. He was an early consultant on that project. The Peterson Farm, the Brooklyn Park Historical Farm, and most renowned is what you're looking at, the Minnesota Zoo. The next series of slides is primarily made up of the mock-up boards found in his collection, and those were used for printing promotional material. So let's start with his early success. His firm, Interdesign Incorporated. 5 men in their 30s, 3 of whom are U of M trained or are teaching here, combine the talents of architecture, landscape architecture, graphic design, and engineering to create a firm that literally roared to success. Established in 1969, it secured the contract for the Minnesota Zoo in 1970. 8 years later, the first open-air zoo in the Northern Hemisphere opened in Apple Valley, Minnesota. 500 acres, $30 million, 1,500 specimens from 250 species, 2,000 varieties of plants, 11 natural lakes, and a 100,000 saltwater whale pool. Now, the whales were the only animals captured in the wild, and the rest were purchased from other zoos. We're going to zoom in a little bit on that picture. And this is the climatology analysis, just to give you an idea of how thorough their work was. So a year later, and before funding was secured, the plan for the State Zoological Gardens wins a major design award. Inner design firm flipped the script on zoos. Just remember how transformative the Minnesota Zoo was when it opened. The plan for the proposed Minnesota Zoo Gardens was the winner of the annual design competition for Progressive Architecture magazine, and over 700 design plans were submitted. Ralph Rapson and Associates also won an award that year in its competition for the new humanities buildings at the University of Minnesota Morris. And speaking of Rapson, somehow I always manage to weave this next image into my talks. Rapson's glass cube. So this was, at the same time these plans were moving forward on the zoo, another experiment was hatching. Like the zoo, the script is flipped. Who is confined? Who's being watched? So here we have another mock-up board, but it's also marked up. As you can see, maybe some faint red notes. So foundational to the zoo board's recommendation was the health of the animals. This was both economical and ethical. And to do so required a radically unique plan. It had to be entirely self-sufficient. Greenhouses to grow the grass required to feed all the animals, and solar panels for clean energy, and to provide animal health buildings, which you see here, with a surgical suite, an X-ray, pharmacy, and several special purpose laboratories and offices for the veterinary staff. Remember the wow of the monorail? Did you know that each train accommodated wheelchairs long before the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990? And 8,000 square feet of solar panels, seen in the photograph, provide heat for the station and hot water for the main building. The Minnesota exhibit, over 100 species of the various habitats found in our state, were presented there, including underwater habitats. The Japanese Macaque exhibit features a northern primate from across the globe, perfectly at home in our climate. The tropical exhibit features animals of the Southeast Asian rainforest. Skylights and shade provide maximum light in the winter and protection from excessive heat and light in the summer. Interpretive displays. They're exciting, modern, and playful. In going through the newspaper clippings portion of his files, I found this from the Minnesota Daily about a year before the zoo was going to open. There won't be any elephants or apes begging behind bars at the new zoo being built in Apple Valley because the visitors, not the animals, will be confined. And so the Minnesota Zoo opened on May 22nd, 1978, and one headline read, "Rare species and fast food vendors run wild at the zoo." Yes, the article was bemoaning that all roads lead to the Dairy Queen, and that equal care for healthy food choices for the humans would have been appreciated. So did you know that straws were purposely absent from the very beginning at the Minnesota Zoo, and that the main complaint of the zoo thus centered on snack options and the inflated prices. The Jackson Public Library. No animals here, but sometime after the zoo and before another major wildlife center in Minnesota was built, Dewey Thorbeck designed the library in my hometown, my first job in high school. Understated on the outside, belies the incredible, inviting space on the inside. How delighted I was the afternoon I stumbled across this board, and there was serendipity in the searching. The International Wolfe Center. So back to the topic at hand, Thorbeck's award-winning design for the renovation and expansion of the International Wolfe Center in Ely, Minnesota. And the center advances the survival of wolf populations by teaching about wolves, their relationship to wild lands, and the human role in their future. And as you can see, it won an award, the first award given by Smithsonian Magazine. And this is the mock-up board that I found in his collection. And it describes the International Wolfe Center as an expression of a North Woods lodge. And that's the interior. The exhibit is designed by the Science Museum of Minnesota. This was our feature image, and it's the Agricultural Operations Management Center on the Crookston campus. It's now known as the University Teaching and Outreach Center, and it was dedicated in 1993 and serves for the animal and equine science on the Crookston campus, featuring a riding arena, stables, a tack room for the equine science program. It also houses some 40-plus horses. The arena regularly serves as a host for regional riding and horse shows. And that's from the U of M Crookston News archives. I'll just note that this was an AIA Minnesota Chapter Design Award winner. You can see why. All right, back to the idea of a animal interpretive center. This one is the Purina Farms Ralston Purina Company, 55 miles west of St. Louis. And Thorbeck Architects provided programming, site design, exhibit design, and architecture to emphasize the lasting relationship between humans and animals. Let's return to Minnesota. He shared with me the concept master plan for the historic Andrew Peterson farmstead in Carver County. This master plan was an extensive document, one that describes the historical value of the property, the stakeholders, and the goals of the restoration. And progress continues as, of course, funding allows. And I'm sharing these images with you from that master plan because they speak to the beauty of the rural landscape and how integral regional architecture is to our sense of place. And in case you're not aware, let me just interject that it's this farmer's diary that was found, 50 years later and became the basis of the series of books by Moberg called The Immigrant. So there's the barn and silo, and at the bottom, Dewey's rendering. And you can see the charm in his illustrations. And this is how he would restore the 1885 farmhouse. and it's determined that the farmhouse from the picture was a light blue with white trim. And I think he's convinced me that's what I want to do next with my house. Yeah, this is the Thorstein Veblen farmstead in southeastern Minnesota in Rice County. It's a National Historic Landmark. And we have this photograph, and then this structure stabilization plan that was developed in 2012. And when I spoke with Dewey about a month ago, he talked about barn restoration. And when a barn is no longer used as a barn, it loses the windbreak and insulation that the bales of hay provided. It becomes weaker. The best preservation is use. You might recognize this. This is the Anderson Center in Red Wing, Minnesota, a haven for artists. This is also on the National Registry of Historic Places, and Dewey Thorbeck created the master plan for this property as a multi-use facility for the arts, and it's been tremendously successful. And these are his books. Dewey was raised on the Thorbeck farm in northern Minnesota. He has a U of M architecture degree and then went on to Yale for his master's degree. And there he earned the Rome Prize Fellowship, a 2-year fellowship in Rome, Italy. And there he became a keen observer. Hills were for villagers. The rich soil in the valleys was for growing food. So opposite of what rural America looked like. And throughout his career, the strong connection between climate, place, historical connections between humans and animals have been the driving force of his designs. The center book cover is from the deep water wool shed in Australia, what he cites as an excellent example of prioritizing animal well-being, which in turn promotes the health and well-being of animal handlers. Optimal ventilation using water and breeze cooling systems, shading to avoid light shining into the sheep's eyes, which would startle them, thoughtful sheep flow, long chutes, count pens, separate buildings for chemicals, and even the isolation of noise to the machine shed. It's creative, economical, and resolves functional and climatic issues. Throughout this series of books, he advocates that our wellness is tied to animal wellness, even the critical issue of separating domesticated and wild animals. And he states global issues of climate change, food production and security, potable water resources, renewable energy, and human, animal, and environmental wellness must be vigorously addressed to accommodate a rapidly increasing world population. He states more firmly, the world will become a better place when architects and other design professionals become as excited about opportunities to work in rural landscapes as they are in urban landscapes. It is a mistake for the design schools and design professions to fundamentally ignore rural areas. Let me add that the Center for Rural Design was founded by Dewey Thorbeck, and those project papers are housed in the university archives. I can't cover in a short time the important work that Dewey and the University of Minnesota has done in this field. I highly recommend his books, especially the third, as his travel diary sketches of rural landscapes around the world charm the reader to consider his advice. I'm so pleased that he's begun the process of donating his work to the Northwest Architectural Archives. Dewey is now affiliated as a research fellow at the Minnesota Design Center in the College of Design and maintains still his architectural firm. Thank you.
All right, let's say we have time maybe for one or possibly two questions. So does anyone have a question for our presenters? All right.
When they're, okay. When they are rehabbing the mining area, how do they actually rebuild the soil, and how do they reintroduce animals, native animals, or does it just kind of happen?
Well, the project began in the early 2000s at the request of the mining companies. At that time, they were providing funding, and the Minnesota legislature and the U of M, all three parties were actively involved in creating a template for how to include, so it would be community-driven by the people who lived there. And they identified the barriers of what the problems were and then how to move forward. And so they worked with about 5 different mining communities, and they developed extensive plans for how to go about that, right, to restore the nutrients, and engaged in some of that mound moving and soil adding the nutrients, right, chemically to what was essentially dead land. And then they seeded it, and then things begin to grow. And they used all native plants specific that are supposed to be there, and did their best in the places where they were able to do this work to shape the land so that it looked like the rest of the vista. Unfortunately, only some of this work has been done, and that's why it's important that all their work is here and that it's accessible for anyone to look at, to use, and to implement. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
And the animals that are being reintroduced, is there a deliberate?
No, they come there on their own because what they need is there.
All right, thank you. So a couple of announcements. We invite you to see some of our exhibits. Second and third floor, Seeing Child Labor through the photography of David Parker. And then we have 2 exhibits that are closing. So this is your last chance to see them. A Woman's Place, Women and Work, right across the hall in the main gallery. And Rapunzel Peanuts and Thousand-Year Eggs, about food in the pre-modern era, in the Wallen Center Gallery. So I encourage you to take advantage of those. Remember, you can see the video of today's presentation on the University of Minnesota Library's YouTube channel. And join us again on April 3rd for a presentation from Kathy Allen, the librarian at the Horticultural Library, called Collies, Trogons, and Bugs, Oh My. Thanks, everyone.